Regardless of what its Russian protectors do here in the Security Council, the Assad regime should be on clear notice. The United States does not accept Syria's use of chemical weapons. As we did in April, we will do it again if we must. We will defend the international standard against chemical weapons use. It would be wise for the Assad regime to heed this warning.
Well, that's UN Ambassador Nikki Haley threatening the possibility of new American airstrikes in Syria if there are more chemical attacks. And activists say that there have been, the regime, they say, using cluster bombs and chlorine attacks. This as Russia again vetoed a United Nations Security Council resolution that called for investigating the use of chemical weapons. The U.S. accusing Syrian dictator Bashar al-Assad of continuing to kill his own people on a scale that remains unimaginable, all with the apparent blessing and help of Vladimir Putin and the Russian government. So, can this carnage really stop? Former UN Ambassador John Bolton joins us, senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, a Fox News contributor, and chairman of the Gatestone Institute here in New York. Ambassador, Putin, I mean, he's Assad's linebacker. I mean, he's been blocking every move of the United Nations, every effort by the West to go after him and stop this.
Look, I think it's been clear that Moscow has wanted to keep the Assad regime in power since the Arab Spring began, since the first protests, since the civil war broke out. And there are very clear reasons why. At Tartus, Russia has its only naval base outside the former Soviet Union, and now at Latakia in Syria, they have their only air base outside the former Soviet Union. It's a wedge into the Middle East, and it enables Russia to do what they want to do, which is prop up the regimes, help the governments that they can count on to advance Russian interests. And they are, in essentially every respect, directly contrary to the interest of the United States. So vetoing a few Security Council resolutions, just a day's work for the Russian foreign ministry.
And we're willing to sit down and shake hands with Putin. Well, he's got the blood of the Syrians on his hands. 400,000 people said to be trapped right now. Assad using starvation. Hundreds of thousands already killed.
Right. I'm afraid this is just the first phase of an ongoing conflict in the Middle East, because one consequence that we're seeing developing now, extraneous to the civil war in part, but related to it, obviously, is the destruction of the ISIS caliphate in what used to be Syria and Iraq. And Iran is now using the campaign against ISIS to build up a coalition involving the Baghdad government, controlled by Shia Iraqis and really dominated by Tehran, the Assad regime in Syria, and the terrorist group Hezbollah in Lebanon, to form an arc from Iran itself all the way to the Mediterranean in preparation for what could be the next fight against Jordan and the oil-producing monarchies on the Arabian Peninsula, as well, obviously, as threatening our close ally, Israel. So despite the carnage in the Syrian civil war, some of which was unquestionably caused by Assad's use of chemical weapons, you've had the destruction wrought by ISIS's efforts, and we could now well see the next stage in a conventional, or even worse, a battle that does involve nuclear or chemical weapons for hegemony in the Middle East between Iran on one side and the Arabs on the other.
That is certainly chilling, and as you say, predicting that it could potentially happen. And the Syrian opposition says the same thing. Let me read you a statement from Bassam Rafai. He's with the Syrian American Council about all this. The Syrian American Council condemns Russia's use of its veto before the United Nations Security Council. Since Russia intervened in Syria in September 2015, it has continued to provide cover for the Assad regime to commit the worst crimes against its very own civilians and to fuel the rise of terrorist groups like ISIS and al-Qaeda. Russian forces themselves have even perpetrated egregious war crimes and crimes against humanity in Syria. Russia cannot be considered a partner in the struggle for peace and democracy in Syria. And there are calls, Ambassador, for Putin and Assad to be put on trial for war crimes. What do you think are the chances of that to try and prevent the type of scenario with Iran that you just laid out?
Well, zero, basically. But you know, a lot of this, and I thought the statement you just read made this point very clear, that Russia and the Assad regime have been twins in this ever since the beginning. And the notion that you could separate the two of them has always been wrong. And yet, under Barack Obama, and especially with John Kerry as Secretary of State, we heard time and time and time again that Russia and the United States shared the same objective. They both wanted Assad out of power. We've even heard it from the State Department during the Trump administration. It was never true. It's not true today. It wasn't true 7 years ago. Assad is Russia's man in Syria, and they are going to stick together as far as the eye can see.
And finally, Ambassador, peace talks will set to resume later this month in Geneva. I mean, what do you expect of anything?
I really don't expect very much. I think the Iranian-Russian coalition, and that's what it is, it involves Iraq, it involves Assad, it involves Hezbollah, is pretty close to getting what they've wanted, much of it with our help, unfortunately, in arming and training Shia militia and the regular units of the Iraqi army to defeat ISIS, now to begin attacks against our friends, the Kurds, in northern Iraq. I just think we need to be preparing for the next phase of this struggle. It's not just against international terrorism and the threat of Iran's nuclear weapons, although we obviously need to stay on top of those. It's the next conflict in the Middle East, which I'm afraid could be in preparation.
Yeah, and with them building up their forces in Lebanon and along the Israeli border, that's exactly what you predict. Ambassador John Bolton, thank you, as always, for your insight.